Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Jayna Brown, Professor of Humanities and Media Studies at the Pratt Institute in BK, the author of Babylon Girls, Black Women Performers and the Shaping of the Modern, which was published by Duke University Press in 2008. And it just published Black Utopias, Speculative Life and the Music of Other Worlds, of which Alexis Gumbs writes, what does Black speculative practice feel like under the skin? What does it sound like? Where does it take us? Jayna Brown studies centuries of strange Black diviners and offers a map over the universe that is not about the stars, but about a Blackness that births and rebirths life in contradiction quantum multiplicity.
That's lovely. I don't think I've heard the whole thing.
Yes, lovely and a mouthful. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a wonderful, wonderful invitation.
I'm glad to hear that. I was a big fan of Babylon Girls, and there is a way, given the hidden figures, for lack of a better way to describe it, that you unearthed in that first book. In some ways, the work that you're doing in Black Utopias is a continuum, right? Particularly in terms of finding, these primarily Black women figures, right, to a certain extent, who've been lost to history. Even the ones that we know, like a Sojourner Truth, right, part of their story, right, has been largely, lost to history, right, and framed in a certain kind of way for us. Mm-hmm. But you begin the book talking about your father. Mm-hmm. And who your father was as this kind of radical figure in the 60s and the 70s, the transformation he goes through, after being faced with incarceration, how he becomes this kind of mystic. And I was struck by the fact that you started there. And you talk about this book as a way of residing in spaces of ambiguity, right? And that was one of the things that your father gave you in terms of thinking about this work. And then the irony, right, that your father passes literally the day after you turn in the manuscript. So talk a little bit about, who your father was in relationship to you as an intellectual, and in particular in relation to this work that you produced.
Well, I think that part of what was so interesting about it is that there wasn't sort of a direct, imputation. There wasn't a direct, right. And so I came to a lot of what I write about and my politics, without really a sense of what he was about. I wasn't raised with him. Mm-hmm. I mean, I knew him as a child, and we would hang out, and he would take me around with him. And so I did have some relationship to him and his politics. But I came to it, and I was thinking about this earlier, that in some ways, if you are a thinking Black person, you come to these politics anyway, right. Where you're like, things are not nice for us, man, and what can we do about it? Right. And but it was such a direct, he was an English major, and he got his PhD, or he went to school for his PhD in English and became a Black Studies professor and agitated for Black Studies on campus, etc.
When you talk early in the book, that, this is a book about Black utopias, right? And you challenge the way that we think about utopias. It's so much more open-ended than the ways that we typically talk about it. And this idea of using Black speculation as a methodology, something that might have been impossible to argue even 20 years ago, right? As a methodology, right? What does it mean to frame this book in what is the unknown or the unknowable, in that context?
Well, there was a lot of sort of pushback about writing about utopias, or skepticism, actually. Well, you're talking about totalities, then you're talking about, it's dangerous because it leads to authoritarianism, or it's escapist, right?
Right.
And as I kind of looked at utopian studies and thought about, what we kind of get up to, I was like, so for instance, escapism escape is one of our central tropes, of course,
Right.
So thinking of it as a methodology was partly in response to all the kind of diagnostic reading that we were doing in the 90s, sort of pointing out or making us aware of how oppression worked, these systems of oppression. And I said, what would happen if we kind of tried to talk about what our response was to it, how we are resilient, how we refuse to be bound by these violent forms of oppression, these violent regimes. What would it look like to think about? And this, I guess there is a continuation with my previous book, thinking about dance and performance as a kind of way to embody that resilience. But it's, the way I was thinking about it, and the way I kind of was incorporating it into my study of literature and art, is that it's a practice. Utopia is a practice, right? We can't see it from here because it's the result of epistemological developments. It's a continual becoming, an embrace and change itself. And part of the project is decentering the human, thinking about the human, estranging ourselves from the idea of the human. Right, Sylvia Wynter helps us think about this. Human is hierarchical. The idea, the concept of the human is hierarchical. It's created to exclude. It's created to master, categorize, control. And what I think is, well, since Black people are not recognized as human, as Sun Ra says, we have the freedom not to be. We have the freedom to create modes of being, create modes of existence that are not bound by these oppressive disciplinary regimes and systems that would seek to debilitate us, kill us, control us, use us. And so I look to forms of art and vision that refuse and resist.
The human piece, you even write that part of the reason why you won't engage or embrace a term like post-human, right? Because post-human is this reference to this hierarchy that's connected to the human. And of course, the work of someone like Jayna Jackson talking about the kind of animal dynamic of Black identity. You find your sources in this book, right? The folks that you're most interested in, you call them Black mystics and mad souls, right? I was not raised as a 7-day Adventist, but my parents sent me to a 7-day Adventist grade school, the only all-Black 7-day Adventist school in the South Bronx, right? For the first 1 through 8 grades. And 7-day Adventists follow the teachings of a woman by the name of Ellen G. White, who was a mystic.
Okay.
So, when I saw your framing, and particularly these women mystics that you identify, the Black women who are on the psychic highway, talk a little bit about these women and why they were significant to you to tell this story about Black utopias, and what really is their relationship to ideas of Black freedom making, right, in the 19th century. And I'll start with Isabella Van Wagenen, who I had to pause, because I was like, well, who is that, right? And then when you're like, because we don't talk about her that way, right? Yes. We only talk about Sojourner Truth. So talk a little bit about who this figure is, particularly the figure that doesn't resonate with us, as you described, in terms of liberal feminist politics.
Well, what I found, where I found Sojourner Truth, or why I was drawn to writing about her, was when I found out that she had belonged to this scandalous sect, the Kingdom of Matthias. And I was like, whoa, that's Sojourner? Let me find out some more. And, the way she gets remembered is so different than is according to these kinds of conventions, these conservative conventions that Black studies kind of gets caught in, and I was fascinated by her choices to live in communities, rather than in nuclear family. I was struck by her being drawn to what I call, intensities. She was drawn to these really intense sects, and what could that mean for us to rethink what we mean by radical? She was a radical of many stripes. She was anti-cleric. She was, not into organized church, because organized church, of course, didn't let women. Black organized churches didn't let women preach.
Jayna Lee, Zilpha Elaw, Rebecca Cox Jackson, figures who are less well known, obviously than Sojourner Truth. How did you find these women and the work that they were doing, in this on this psychic highway in the 19th century?
Well, studying Black women, you always got to look in the cracks and the nooks and crannies. Got to look in the footnotes. You got to, see where they, and then you follow those trails, and you find things like people's autobiographies,
right?
And so I was just fascinated by how freaky this word comes to me. You see these women in these trim little outfits, and they are up to some stuff. It's like, you're going to decide to hike and walk for thousands of miles, and and say, like, my husband doesn't understand me, so he's gone. And I was really, when I discovered Rebecca Cox Jackson, that was it. I was like, because she left volumes and volumes of journal.
Yeah.
And nobody's very much, there's the woman who collected those, but there's not enough recognition of this woman who was fascinating. A Black Shaker woman who started a Shaker community in Philadelphia for Black people, had a long-term partner also named Rebecca.
Yep.
Her writing is surreal. There aren't a lot of angels, it's all these kind of archetypal abstract beings, diamonds in the sky, dreams of violent dreams, some of them, and I think too, that's, rather than trying to fit her into this sort of, long-suffering female, Christian believer, to kind of think of her using the word mystic kind of, or visionary, opens up for me, But then, of course, doing the research that I wasn't raised with Christianity. So a lot of this Christian eschatological stuff just blew my mind too. I was like, really? The Second Awakening? And, what everybody got up to in that burnt over district, these tent revivals that sounded like they got pretty wild, so that sort of led me into my theoretical thinking about consciousness and what it would mean to the melting times, what it would mean to sort of shift your ideas of subjectivity.
You talk about these women redefining what radical meant in the 19th century, right? And when we think about, the birth of Black radicalism, if you will, in the 19th century, it's always about the work of David Walker, right? It's always about the work of Martin Delany. We don't even connect, right? Because we think about Delany as this intellectual figure, right? This kind of, marker blueprint for the Black male intellectual. So we don't even really include Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and folks like that in this freedom-making generation. But you argue that we really do need to be more inclusive in that regard and think about, Sojourner Truth and Jayna Lee and Zilpha Elaw and Rebecca Cox Jackson as doing a radical politics at the time that was as important as some of this more mainstream radical politics. in that.
And in ways that actually make us rethink what we mean about being radical. I mean, you know, they were more, they weren't concerned with sort of nation state belonging or building of a nation state or, becoming manly by owning things, possessing land,
or taking pictures of yourself,
or taking. There weren't enough pictures. I know. There weren't enough pictures of these women, but so radical. There are a lot of ways of being radical. What other people talk about, what I think of as wholesale radicalism. So they were like, everything has to change, not just this, but everything. So they questioned marriage, they questioned sexuality. I think needs more stuff written about, because I think that is an interesting sort of point of how people were living alternatively. They were medical, they were, like David Ruggles, who starts his water cure there, and he gets remembered as an abolitionist, but not as a holistic healer, They were, vegetarians or ate whole, so, and they were part of their time in that way too. I mean, there was the sort of larger movements going on around health and everything, and it, sparked by abolition. Right. But, she was a wholesale radical, and I think in those terms, we get caught up in this kind of nation building idea, and especially in terms of utopias, and I think it's more anarchist. I think what I'm thinking of is a much more anarchist kind of way, and we're not looking for recognition or belonging or inclusion, but in sort of changing everything.
You mentioned them being a product of their times, right? And they're all, these folks who are committed to one way or another to religion, but not organized religion. And you describe, that moment for them where historically, religion is a condition of communication, the language of change and the mode of possibility, right? So they're drawn to religious discourse because of the radical potential for it, as opposed to simply being connected to the idea of religion and higher powers. Like you mentioned one of the figures, for them, the idea of religion, whatever the religion was, the idea was, to submit to this higher power, whatever the religion it happened to be at the time.
Yes, I think you articulated it, very better than I could. And, they were self-authorized, they were like, God came to me. And, Rebecca Cox Jackson talks about, the lightning coming. She said, I opened the door to the lightning and it transformed me. And then she becomes, clairvoyant. She becomes a healer. These are the powers that were, bestowed upon her. And they, so like you said, it opens up, right? That kind of relation. Having said that, I mean, there's also very, the language of my Lord and Master, and you find this with Alice Coltrane as well, and so it's not sort of a straightforward what we think of as feminist message. Sojourner Truth was very, devoted to Matthias for a long time,
You just mentioned Alice Coltrane, and that's a nice, segue. First of all, as you talk about in the chapter on Alice Coltrane, it's not a whole lot of scholarly work done on her. Part of it is, as you mentioned, the problem of the harp. And what to do with the harp in the context of jazz studies, and how we think about it, right? And also the problem of John, right? At least in her world for a time, Father John, right? Is she simply an acolyte of John Coltrane, right? And not functioning as a creative in her own sense. In these kind of double ways in which she's not engaged by both jazz studies or even feminist jazz studies, right? Because of these particularities. What drew you to Alice Coltrane in this book?
Well, again, that sort of interest in what Black women were doing, what Black women are doing, listening to some Alice Coltrane and going, why is she not even on the map? Yes. Thinking about, where is she in jazz studies? I'd open up a book about John Coltrane and say, oh, there'll certainly be some things about Alice in here. And there'd be maybe a paragraph or two. I won't name names. I'm not going to name names right now, but there's enough books about John Coltrane that don't have anything about Alice Coltrane. Yep. And she's an amazing musician in her, I was about to say in her own right, which is a phrase that really bothers me. But she was an amazing musician. She just challenged. And she didn't, she went about her business, and I think what it is, and this is the way I thought about it in the book, is that what was a fundamental part of her spiritual principles was the concept or the practice of devotion. So she wasn't an acolyte of John. She was practicing devotion with John.
Yeah.
She says, we mingled. So to think of John's as somehow sui generis coming out of the mind of this male genius doesn't know justice either. And it doesn't mean we have to say Alice, influenced his artistry. I think they had a philosophy that challenged the idea of the individual in this way, right? They became part of this larger consciousness and produced music out of there. And some of his most radical work comes out of this period, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're on this journey together. And clearly his music changes when he's on that journey with her. And it's striking, right? Because when we think about one of his contemporaries he worked very closely with, someone like Pharoah Sanders, there's a moment where we might talk about where Pharoah Sanders' work mimics Coltrane's in some way, but Pharoah Sanders has now been able to have a 50+ year career in which we see him as distinct from John Coltrane. Even now with this body of work that Alice Coltrane has left, right, we still very much read her, right? She's a John Coltrane of the harp, might be some of the ways, that we would describe her work there, right? And the idea when you mentioned devotion, that when Coltrane dies, she's still devoted to that journey, right? Part of it is a devotion to him as her husband and former partner, right? But it's still a continuance of the journey that the two of them were on. And she had a duty, right, in those early works after his death, right, to continue that journey.
Those early works. But then she's called on her own. Right. She's called and she becomes Turiya Sangeetananda, and she's on her, she's free on her own journey, own creative journey, and she doesn't leave John behind. But, again, it's this challenge to this idea of individualism. I think we have trouble with that. So John's there, but she's doing, she made what? How many albums? 7 albums?
Right.
After that. And all of them are incredible. And absolutely. I don't think there are derivative of John particularly.
Yeah, I would agree.
They're not derivative of John. And, I think we just have to understand her on different terms than we're used to using in jazz studies, especially in feminist studies, in religious studies. We have to think of her in different terms than those kinds of fields set.
And in the spirit of the book, in Black Utopias, right, you also recover her in a contemporary context. Her great nephew, Stephen Ellison, right, who we all know as Flying Lotus, right? Yes. And the fact that he consciously references in his work, her impact on him. And when she stops playing the Wurlitzer, but he reclaims that particular version of Alice Coltrane for a younger generation.
And the harp, right? One of his most pieces that most explicitly references his great aunt is Auntie's harp.
Auntie's harp, yeah.
And his work is, it's of its moment. It's doesn't include a huge band, but yet it's still collective in that sense, right? What he packs into his work is the sounds and the references to much larger collectives.
Yeah. I want to read this quote towards the end of the book. With this book done, I hope to open up new imaginings, new forms of beingness, and instead of basing themselves in some dialectical struggle, look to radical relationalities and qualities of sentience outside of human-centric ontological framework. What does that mean for those of us working in the academy? And what does that mean for us working in Black studies within the academy?
Well, so I grew discontented with the Hegelian model of the master slave and how much room and how much we're basing our ideas of change and sense of selfhood on this kind of a model, because to me, it's antagonistic, it's binary, it's, a fight mano a mano between men. And I said, what about these other sort of forms of or these other ways of forming a subjectivity? If we think of ourselves as multiply related to lots of different kinds of other entities, to get a little spacey. And I'm drawing, I was inspired by Henry Bergson, who's very much thinks about the world and the self as being continually becoming. And that really attracted me. And this is through Deleuze. Now, I was drawn to Henry Bergson, more than Deleuze. I drew on Henry Bergson actually, because he was also working during the time period of, a lot of the people that I'm writing about. The dialectic. So I wanted to think outside the dialectic about it, or think differently about the formation of self. By the end of the book, I was thinking, if we're really decentering the human, and here I'm drawing on some of the new materialism, some of the works in the field of new materialism. If we're really decentering the human and thinking of ourselves as embedded in wider ecologies, then we need to question the idea of species hierarchy, the idea of sentience as being sort of based in language and our ideas of what self-awareness means. And Alexis Pauline Gumbs does wonderful work in her new her book Undrowned, thinking about other species, and thinking about dolphins and sea animals who have completely different ways of communicating, and that we think of as maybe not as sentient, right? As Mel Chen says, and so I started thinking about ecologies and about other species and about sort of rereading Darwin, thinking about other forms of evolution, what other, so this is where it led me after that, as I was coming out of the book.
Is there any part of the book, we all go into these projects with certain kinds of assumptions of what we're seeking to find and what we're going to find in the end game. Were there any revelations in the writing of this book of things that you just didn't expect to find or didn't expect as kind of an outcome of what's produced in the book?
I think the whole book was not expected. It was so organic. I came to the project as trained by, good Marxists or people who read a lot of Marx, so there wasn't going to be anything about that spiritual stuff, right? There wasn't going to be any fiddling around with, alternative, lifestyles, you know what I mean? And so, but then it really led me, this book, it led me. And the eclectic kind of archives that I look at, frustrated my editor quite a bit, Ken Wessiker, and he was, he'd say, "What does this all have to do with it? What do they all have to do with each other?" And I'd say, "They do. I just can't explain it to you right now, And so I really let the materials lead me in this book, and so there were revelations all along the way. When I started thinking about, particularly chapter 4, which took me a long time. There were revelations in terms of thinking about the self and subjectivity and physicality, the material, trying to not think of them as separate neurons, finding out about how crazy neurons are and what we don't know, about everything. So there, the revelations kept coming, starting with Sojourner Truth, Rebecca Jackson, some of my thinking about Octavia Butler.
Sun Ra.
Sun Ra.
I must say, Professor Brown, in a moment where so many of our younger colleagues are trying to write books that are the last word on something, it is refreshing to read a book that is generative in its openness, generative in the questions that it raises and doesn't necessarily answer, right? And at least from my standpoint, that's the best work that can be done in the field, right? The work that opens up enough space for other people to come in, right? To open up more spaces.
That kind of openness is, part of my political commitment, my feminism, to write as in terms of mastering, of giving the last word. I find it closes down conversations, and that part of my feminist commitment is to open up, to provoke, right? We need so many more books on Rebecca Cox Jackson, on Sojourner Truth, on Alice Coltrane, on Sam Delaney, right? These sort of figures that get called sort of Afrofuturist. But if we really read them, then they maybe change some of the ideas of what we think of as Afrofuturism, right? So yes, I'm opening up is actually intentional and very important to me.
We've been talking with Professor Jayna Brown, who is Professor of Humanities and Media Studies at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. She's the author of Babylon Girls, Black Women Performers and the Shaping of the Modern, which was published by Duke University Press 2008. Shout out to our friend Ken Wessiker. And Black Utopias, Speculative Life in the Music of Other Worlds, which was published by Duke University Press in 2021. It's been great, Jayna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking